Hello, friends. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. She is a research professor of English and Christianity and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author of numerous books, serves on many prestigious boards, a tremendous thinker, writer, and I just wanted to share with you, as I was doing just a moment ago, that I was really impressed and blessed by your material. I had the opportunity to read earlier this year on reading well, and just was a wonderful book in so many ways. So thank you for writing that.
Well, thank you for reading it.
And I'm thrilled to have you today. And specifically, I wanted to share this with my persuasion class, because we've been talking all semester long about persuading others from a Christian perspective, especially those who may not agree with us on particular issues. And of course, one of the perennial issues is the issue of abortion. And the other day I came across something that you had written in 2016 for Christianity Today. And in that piece, you detailed some of your activism, anti-abortion activism. And so could you just describe maybe your history of activism in the pro-life movement and what prompted your activism?
Sure. So I grew up in a Christian home, but it was sort of before the culture wars era that we talk about so often, and where everything was political, and we were all informed and engaged and enraged on every issue, as we are now. And so I had never really thought much about abortion, but in the late 1980s, when these culture wars were ramping up, and I see now that was part of it. We had a crisis pregnancy center come to my church and talk about their ministry and talk about abortion and show us a video. And I just became convicted really in that very moment. Became convicted not only about what abortion was, the taking of an unborn human life, but also just what a tragedy it would be to be a woman in a situation like that, and to feel like that is the best choice that you have in front of you. And so I immediately just felt compassion for women in those situations. The 80s were a time of peak abortion rates in this country. So as a young woman, I mean, I knew lots of people who had abortions, lots of women faced with that decision, none of them who were very happy about it. And so I just became convicted about the issue, and became a volunteer at that crisis pregnancy center, and then that led to me going to the clinics in the city where I lived. There were quite a few clinics there, and protesting and offering help there, and a whole range of activities that have very different kinds of effects in terms of persuasion.
Yeah, and I came of age in the 1980s as well, and I think something that is missed by younger people today is these political perspectives and social perspectives have sort of been locked in, and maybe they don't know the history or the evolution as to how we arrived at this point. And I remember hearing stories. There was a radio program, Dr. James Dobson, Focus on the Family, very popular in Christian circles. And often he would interview people with an organization known as Operation Rescue. And this was an activist organization that went to abortion clinics and actively protested, endeavored to talk women out of having abortions and things of that nature. And you write about a lot of your personal history with this sort of activism. But you also describe in that 2016 piece for Christianity Today that there was a series of events that caused you to rethink some of the strategies and some of the rhetoric of the pro-life movement. So can you describe what happened and how did those events influence your activism, and perhaps how you've changed, if at all, in your present perspective?
Yeah, sure. So because I kind of entered the pro-life movement through the Crisis Pregnancy Center, as I mentioned, I mean, that was my beginnings, that wanting to offer help to women in those situations so that they knew that they had other choices. And so that just, it has always remained the constant. So even when I went to abortion clinics to protest, and became involved with Operation Rescue, or at least our local, our local version of it, I always had in mind, what I was there for. So when I first began to go to the clinics, I actually was like, I was protesting abortion. So I could carry signs that would be outward facing toward the traffic, because I wanted to raise the public's awareness about this issue in the same way that my awareness had been raised. But when I began to be involved in offering help to the women going in to the clinics, then my message and my strategy had to change, because you aren't going to, if you can't offer someone help by shouting at them or scaring them away or intimidating them, when you are trying to offer help to them and you really want them to take the help that you're offering, or at least listen to you, you need to be kind and loving. You need to be someone to whom they would turn to rather than run from. And so as I became more engaged in that, I mean, there are no matter what issue we're talking about, there are different times and places and messages for different audiences. And so that's the important thing we have to keep in mind. But what I began to see is that people were not aware of that. So it became increasingly difficult sometimes to offer help to the women when other protesters would send their messages that really should be directed at the public to them, or surround them, or not let us get to them, or scare them away. And so I just began to see more of a need to refine not only our message, but to know our audience. And then, of course, as these protests around the country increased, and the movement grew, things did get more heated, and the counter protesters came out more. And I know younger people today don't know this history, but there were actually several abortion providers who were killed by people who were claiming to be pro-life and who were against abortion. And eventually that happened in my city to one of the abortion providers that we had been protesting. He was shot by a sniper in his home one evening. And because I was someone who was involved in the protesting and was a spokesperson for them, I did a lot of interviews. I was also interviewed by law enforcement, just because they needed to find the person who did this. And that, turned out to be someone who wasn't affiliated at all with our group, or even from our city, but came from outside. But all of this just caused me to think much more deeply about the role that our messaging and our rhetoric, our language, our actions, how they can contribute to this kind of outcome. It doesn't mean that anyone is responsible for shooting that doctor besides the person who did it, but we do create a climate with our rhetoric and our language, and that's something we really need to think about and take responsibility for. And so that's something that really caused me to have that kind of examination of it.
Yeah, and you wrote specifically that when these things started happening, you thought about how long it had been since you actually changed someone's mind. And as I recall, it had been about a 2-year period, and that had an impact on you. So when you think about the lessons that you learned in persuading others in a social and political context through your experiences, what did you once think at the beginning of your activism as persuasion versus what you think of as persuasion now? Because obviously we're living in a very divisive climate politically and culturally in America. But it seems to me, and maybe it's just the perspective of maturity, but growing up in the 1980s, it seemed like the camps were very well constructed. There were bright lines as to who was in what camp. Mm-hmm. But now it seems very muddied, and it seems very complex, and very nuanced in a lot of issues. So what did you once think of as persuasion, and how has that changed now from the perspective of experiences?
Well, I do think that my experience in have not really thinking as a Christian about abortion at all until this this period of activism and public protest came about. I think that's true of many of us from that time. So I think that what this activism and these protests did, I think that they did accomplish one of many things they set out to accomplish, and that is to raise public awareness about abortion and to just cause us as a nation to kind of think about abortion. I mean, obviously, some of us reject it and we don't want it at all, but that period was a time when 1 in 3 of all pregnancies were ending in elective abortion. That is just incredible to think about. It's still a lot, but it has come down. So I think that we have raised public awareness of abortion. And even though that was so many years ago, it really did change the tide about, sort of collectively. And I think now, of course, as you said, things have changed. It's probably not productive or even safe to go out in mass numbers and protest anywhere, let alone an abortion clinic. And yet there is an entire generation of people who are raised up who are pro-life and now are doing other things like, working in crisis pregnancy centers, which have sort of been there all along, or being, or addressing abortion way earlier in terms of education and discipleship, so that before it even becomes an issue. So once that consciousness was raised, I think it was more productive, and it's proven to be so, to tackle the issue in all these other arenas, in the crisis pregnancy centers, in educational realms, in the church, and then, in the culture. It really, as you said, I love how you put it, it really is more nuanced, because even the terms pro-life and pro-choice don't work anymore, because there are many people who are against abortion, but also think that being pro-life involves a lot more than that. And there are some people who are against abortion who, don't think that being pro-life involves other issues. And so the terms have broken down because the categories have broken down. And so I think we are in a moment now where we actually don't even really know how to be persuasive on this issue. And so this is an important discussion to have, and something I think we need to talk about and think through more.
Well, I certainly appreciate the credibility that you bring to this issue, because I admire the stance that you take on social media and in other places for what you believe in. And I commented on one of your tweets the other day that, when you're getting hit from both sides, it's probably a good indication that you're right where you're supposed to be. And that is sort of reflective of the nuanced age in which we live. And so just to be vulnerable for a moment, I'm one of those guys that I find myself in the past decade really changing my perspective a great deal politically, a great deal culturally. And I grew up in a very similar culture as you did, Christian culture, that really taught us to be politically active, to think of politics from one party's perspective if we were a Christian. And now, because of how things have evolved in our country, I'm feeling a lot of challenges and a lot of dissonance personally about, I'm not sure where I'm at and I'm not sure where I fit anymore. Mm-hmm. And so this brings me to this very divisive issue of abortion, because I still consider myself, if someone were to ask me where I'm at politically, I always describe myself as just right of center. And the reason I say I'm just right of center is because I'm pro-life. Mm-hmm. But I'm pro-life as you just described it. I'm pro-life from womb to tomb. I think we need to have policies in place that consider all of life and not just life of the unborn. And what I'm seeing today is a lot of people seem to leverage the issue of abortion for political gain, and they're not well educated on the subject. They don't have a lot of context as to how we've gotten to this point. And the term that I use, it's almost a political ventriloquism, because they're speaking for the unborn as if the unborn are expressing a political perspective. And so I just want to ask you directly, why do you think it is necessary for abortion to be illegal? And isn't there some evidence that suggests that there is a drop in abortion during Democratic presidencies, which advocate to keep abortion legal and rare and safe, as opposed to Republican presidencies, which advocate for regulation and reversal of Roe v. Wade, which seem to indicate, that we're going backwards in this country. So I'll just shut up and let you speak to that.
Yeah. So I'll answer them in reverse order. So I think, if you look at the rates of abortion, as reported by the Alan Guttmacher Institute, which is, is an arm of Planned Parenthood, they are, for legalized abortions, and they actually do have the most reliable research. And so I accept their numbers. The rate of abortion has been dropping steadily since the late 70s, early 80s, regardless of which administration is in. It's just been a steady drop, which again, I think is wonderful. I think, we are becoming more pro-life, but there are things like, technology, and the sonograms and things like that show life in the womb.
And let me just interrupt you for a moment. Yeah. Can you clarify, because my intuition tells me that no one reasonable is pro-abortion. Am I right on that? Are there people that actually advocate for pro-abortion? Because that's one of the constant arguments that you hear from people that I think are engaging in this ventriloquism.
Right. I mean, I think these labels are just, they ultimately become sort of semantic games. Like we can say pro-life people are just anti-abortion and not pro-life. And we can, I think I just wish that from the beginning, actually if you look at the news coverage in the 60s and 70s, they actually used the terms anti-abortion and pro-abortion rights, and I think that those are the terms we should use, because pro-choice isn't like for all choices either. So no, most people would not consider them. Most people who are pro-choice would not celebrate abortion. There is a small number, the shout your abortion people, and people who brag about having, had 7 or 8 abortions or something like that. Those are rare and in the minority, but most people who consider themselves pro-choice don't think that abortion is a good thing. And of course that's, it's interesting because we should ask why it isn't, but so the surveys continually show that even pro-choice people want to see more restrictions on abortion than we have in law. So the rates are steadily declining. Whether or not the decline under Democratic administrations is correlation or causation is a huge question. There have been a lot of pieces written on this. So I certainly, if I think that policies and programs that would help women in crisis pregnancies, those are clearly going to help bring the rates down. And so I think that both parties should be in favor of those. And yet neither party is consistent, right? The Republicans who are against abortion don't generally support those programs. Yet the Democrats, not only do they want abortion to be legal, but they want much wider access to it than even the American public wants. And so the reason that I think that abortion should be illegal is because I think that the unborn child is a human being that should be protected by law, and that is the basic fundamental purpose of law, is to protect basic human rights and human life. Now, what if that were to happen, and what we would do with, a woman who were seeking an abortion under those circumstances? Those are all questions that would follow, from that, and we aren't anywhere near it. I think that we need to do more work before we worry about the laws, to cultivate a pro-life world. And so, as I say in a piece that I wrote this past week about, the different presidential candidates, just as, I don't want people to be racist in their hearts, but I also, and we need to work on that, but we also need to have laws that prevent people from racial discrimination. The same with the abortion issue. I want people to want these lives to be born once they exist and are conceived. But I also think it's not, I want the law to protect human life, all human lives. So it's not either or, but I recognize, that politics is downstream of culture, as the saying goes, and we have a lot of work to do to cultivate a world in which we don't see killing an unborn child as a solution to whatever the problems might be. And I know that there are many problems that surround these situations.
Yeah, and thank you for your clarity and your honesty there, and expressing that nuance, because I think that's something that is missed in the simplistic dichotomies that that our political system forces us into. We miss that this is a spectrum. There's a large swath of issues. There's a lot of complexity and nuance. And you're exactly right. If we're going to impact what is downstream, then we've got to change what is upstream, and how the culture is being cultivated. So when we think about the issue of abortion, and it really does, if folks are being honest with what they share about their political views and their cultural views, it does seem that for a lot of well-intentioned Christian people, that the issue of abortion is the one issue. So in your estimation, how should the abortion issue influence who we support as a political candidate? And, and then I'd love for you to get into the piece you wrote this week about how you came to choose your political candidate of choice in this current presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, this election really is is a tough one for people who care about a range of issues, and we are, people who are pro-life in a holistic way and care about human beings and human dignity. I don't think we have any good options, at least among the major party candidates. And so, for me, even though I have to think about this and re-examine it, especially in this election, I cannot and will not vote for someone who wants, well, first of all, to keep abortion legal, but even beyond that, who just wants to expand abortion. And even if all of the other issues lined up, I would, for example, when people bring up, well, what if abortions are reduced under a Democratic administration? I think, well, and again, the issues are not the same, but they do have to do with human rights and dignity. I think, well, I would not vote for someone who was for keeping slavery legal, but who would work to reduce the need for slaves. Like, I would find that completely unacceptable. And so, because I believe, unborn children are human beings and vulnerable, and worthy of protection, I just eliminate anyone who denies that in their policies and positions. So that usually leaves me with very few to choose from, because because even a lot of Republicans are not pro-life, and so I have to, so on that basis, I eliminate Biden. And that and I mean, there are some pro-life Democrats, and there's some candidates who might even really express the desire to reduce abortion. Biden is not one of them. And then there are even more severe reasons why I would not support Trump. I don't think that, as important as abortion is to me, as an issue, I would not vote for just any, I mean, there are lots of different kinds of rulers who could outlaw abortion for all the wrong reasons. And so that's why I talked in the essay about, it's not just the what, it's the how. And if you cannot really truly protect human life by stripping away the foundation upon which our belief in human life is based, which is one on truth and reality. And I don't think that President Trump, exists in that kind of sphere. So I say a lot of other things in the essay, but eliminating those two for me, very compelling reasons. Then I voted for the American Solidarity Party candidate. That is a party that is very pro-life, very pro traditional family. They're, I don't agree with all of the things in their platform about economics and other things, but for me, they come closest to what I can support, both in terms of their candidates and their party platform. So that's the party I voted for.
And you wrote in the piece that I think I'm getting the quote right here. You do understand math. So what you wrote. Yes. So you understand the problems with voting for a third candidate yes. in our system. So how would you respond to those folks that say, well, by making that choice, you are making a choice to support one candidate or the other, one into the binary choice?
Well, as you mentioned before, I mean, I get people from both sides saying that. So it's like, well, which one, some will say this vote supports candidate A, and others just say it supports candidate B, and it can't be both. So that doesn't work. But if we look at our history, we know that the two parties that we have now have not always been the parties that we have had. If both parties are hugely unacceptable because of their inconsistency on the most basic, and they are. I mean, as we said before, you can't be, it's one thing to be against abortion, but then to support policies that encourage it. And it's another thing to have policies that might help women in these situations, but also want to expand abortion or not even reduce it. So if both parties are unacceptable to those of us who care about a range of these issues, then we have to do something to change that. And we'll never change it by continuing to vote for either of those two candidates. So I recognize that for this election, a vote like that doesn't have a significant impact. But if we want to rebuild this party system and see the parties change, then there's no reason for them to do that unless they start losing votes.
Did you feel the same sort of angst in 2016?
In 2016, I voted for another third party candidate. But I feel more angst now because I think, as bad as I thought that Trump would be in 2016, he's been worse in some respects. He's been better on the abortion issue. But I also, he's been better than I expected him to be, but I also think that he is worse in terms of just the way that he denies reality and rules by by just saying whatever he needs to say in the moment, even if it contradicts what he said earlier. And I don't think,
I really encourage people to read your piece that came out this week from Christianity Today, because I think it's very helpful in understanding where we're at. And I think you're sort of a precursor to where Christianity, and I use that term generally, is going in our nation. So I think the old dichotomies of the past have seen their last days. And I think something new in the Christian community is emerging. And I think that you're one of the people that is understanding this and leading in that. So I'm appreciative of your efforts. And speaking of Donald Trump, you do write a great deal about him. And you write about this on Reading Well as also about the values that shape us, about who we are. And one of the things that you write about there and that you've spoken about is that we cannot embrace an idea. And this was big in the 1980s, right? The Republican Party, something that they railed against growing up that I heard quite often was the ends do not justify the means. Back then, I think they called it situational ethics. They talked a lot about situational or circumstantial morals. But it seems now that a lot unfortunately, on the quote unquote religious right have embraced this idea with Donald Trump, and he's been problematic for a lot of reasons, but an issue that is near and dear to me is the racial inequalities, the Black Lives Matter movement, things of that nature in our country. So could you talk for a minute about embracing this idea of the ends justify the means and why we shouldn't embrace that as Christians? And then I'd like to get into your thoughts on how your activism in abortion parallels to the current activism we see in racial matters today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So this is, yeah, you and I were raised on these same principles of of integrity and character and ends not justifying the means. And so you and I apparently believed those things, and now we are seeing that so many of the people who said those things are now abandoning those principles, and it's very disheartening. But that's okay, I want to say, because I do think that we are going to see something new, and I do want to do my part in that. And I also want to say, directly to your students, that because I've been teaching students for over 2 decades now, that they have a big part in helping this happen, because it is these students who have been raised, the next generation raised by people who profess these standards, who are seeing the hypocrisy, they are seeing the reversals, and they're seeing, they believed the heart of what was being said. Young people, this generation is largely pro-life, but they want to be so holistically. And I am so thankful that they are the ones who really are pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. And so I feel an obligation to honor the principles that we said we believed in to this next generation. And so it's we are seeing people who have changed their ethics, and it's disheartening, as I said, but in another way we can just say, well, thank God we are seeing, the veil is being lifted. We're seeing what was underneath, and so those of us who want to continue to abide by those principles need to continue and press on. And that's why when it comes to the racial issues, the racial unrest that we are experiencing, and also the Me Too, Church Too movement too is all mixed up in this. My passion against abortion causes me to be passionate about these things too, because these are issues of human rights and human dignity. And I do not understand. Well, I have some ideas and theories, and they aren't pleasant, and I'm not going to make accusations, but I don't, other than those, I cannot explain why people would not, who care about the unborn life in the womb, would not also care just as much about the Black lives in the streets whose lives are being lost, or who have been oppressed for generation and generation, or the women who are being abused and oppressed. To me, they are connected because they have to do with human life and human dignity. And so those weren't issues that I was thinking about back in the 80s and 90s when I was protesting abortion. I'm sure they were problems. I was not aware. Now I am aware. And so I feel that same passion and want to persuade. I can't go to the racist clinic and protest there, because there isn't, that's not how it works. But I am trying to do what I can to see for myself and understand better than I did before, and to listen and to advocate as I can, as I think we all should.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that willingness to learn. And I think that's the best position that we can take as part of the normative culture, to be willing and humble to say, hey, we want to listen, we want to learn, we want to advocate for what is right. And you're exactly right. All of these issues are connected. They should be connected in our minds, and we should seek to remain consistent. And so if you were giving advice, and you just gave some good advice to my students, but to young people in general that are wanting to be influential, that are wanting to be active in such a divisive age? How would you counsel them? And then beyond that, from a Christian perspective, sometimes I struggle with this idea of, should we even want a platform? Should we want to be influential? And how does that intersect with what our society thinks about celebrity? And most recently, even, we've seen all of the problems associated with the establishment of a Christian celebrity culture, where we elevate people not necessarily based upon their credentials or their character, but based upon their notoriety or their connections to people in the past. And, it's almost become, a truism. We lift people up and only to tear them down. So as Christians, how does that connect with the example of Christ being a servant to all? How would he have navigated the celebrity culture in which we live? So I've given you a lot to unpack there, but some advice to young people, and then beyond that, how should we approach the platforms that we have and the influence that we have, and should we aspire to it?
Yeah, well, I think I can actually combine those two things, because I do see them as connected. I mean, the reality is that we all have platforms and we all have influence. We have influence in our circles and our spheres, with our friends, with our family, wherever, whoever we are connected to, we have an influence on. And we need to never lose sight of that fact. And we need to never think that those influences in our everyday real lives are more or any less important than any that we might have on social media or through books or through blogs or anything like that. And so I don't think that we should seek that kind of platform. I think that we should be who we're called to be, who God has called you to be. And if, this is the stage in your life as you're in college, where you're discovering that and you're learning that, and it may change over life, but you fulfill that calling well, and you will influence in that sphere well, no matter how many numbers of people are involved or how many clicks or how many likes. Now, those things can grow and they can expand. I know it's, they have for me. It was not something that I sought. It was something that has come as a result of the work that I have been doing and the way that I've been doing the work and the audience that my work has reached. And so I've leaned into that, so to speak. But it doesn't matter to me at all, how many clicks or likes I get. I just want to be faithful and be wise and yes, to use that whatever influence I have for the good. And what I would say about how to be an influence wherever you are is to be, first of all, humble, and second of all, courageous, which is not, as I talk about in On Reading Well, is not, I think we all know that the opposite of courageous is cowardice, and we get that. But the other opposite, at the other end of courage is recklessness. And I think we see a lot of people being reckless in the name of courage, when recklessness is never virtuous. A lot of people are willing to do damage just to get a tweet or a like, or to be provocative, or and without thinking about the kind of destruction that can cause. So we need to be humble, we need to be courageous, but not reckless. And part of humility is again, as I said before, is listening. It's actually, I think, in this divisive, polarized culture, it is more important to listen than to proclaim that you are right. Because if you listen to someone and you win their confidence and trust, and if you think they are wrong about something, then that confidence and trust will count for more in the end than simply you making a counterpoint or an argument about how they are wrong. Worry about you being right, not other people being right. And be humble and courageous, and do work well where you are, and the rest will follow.
Yeah, that's well said. And you mentioned a lot of the virtues that are really, really important that you address in On Reading Well. And I haven't had an opportunity yet to read your other books, but I'm looking forward to that. And On Reading Well was just it really just resonated with my soul. So again, thank you for that. And you mentioned some of those foundational values that are necessary to appropriately balance public life, a public life of persuasion while maintaining the integrity and our Christian witness. So you mentioned humility, you mentioned courage. Are there others that would go along with that you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, a couple more that I talk about in On Reading Well that I think are good is diligence. I often have students come to me and say that they want to be like me and they want to do the things that I do, which is wonderful. I'm very honored. But when they do that, one of the first things I tell them, and often because I teach English and I write, it's, aspiring writers who will come to me, and I will tell this 22 or 23 or 21-year-old, well, if you want to be like me, don't write your first book until you're 47. And then their jaws hit the hit the floor, because they look at me and they think that I've always been this way and always had what I have. But no, I worked very, very hard for many, many years before I even thought about having a more public place in the world. So be diligent. I mean, diligence and hard work will build the kind of foundation that will allow you to continue to grow. Whereas I'm seeing a lot of people in their 30s who shot to fame in their 20s and they peaked already because they didn't have a strong foundation. They had their one-hit wonder, and then there was nothing left to stand on. So being diligent and faithful in your work is really important. And the other thing I want to say is to kind of loop back to an earlier part of our discussion. And maybe I'm speaking to myself here and projecting that onto others, but I do want to say that when you see the hypocrisy of the leaders around you, and those especially who are older than you that you believed in and trusted, when you see that, don't let that be the cause of you abandoning what is true and right and just. Rather, let it convict you even more to pursue those things. Don't ever let someone else's failure to live up to their professed convictions cause you to abandon yours. And I know that's hard. It's very easy to give in to despair and discouragement when we see people abandoning what they said that they stood for. But that I just encourage you to let that strengthen and encourage you even more to be the person who doesn't do that.
Well said. And I think you pretty well addressed my last question that I had for you. There was this idea that we're living in a very discouraging age. It's not all that hard if you're paying just the least amount of attention to what's happening around us to be discouraged or confused or otherwise disillusioned with the current state of affairs of our nation. But I think you addressed it very well there. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that idea, if you're speaking to all of us really that are enduring this age?
I would just say, and again, you referred to this earlier, that that young people today often don't know how we got to this point that we are at, and I guess this point is the point of discouragement, and at least it feels like that. But realize that this is the end of something, and it needs to happen, and so we're going to go through this kind of bad time where we are seeing, the sheep separated from the goats, and we're seeing veils lifted away, and the ugliness underneath. But realize that is necessary in order to get to the next thing. And so, something new is going to happen. It is happening now. And so this will pass, and something else good will be birthed out of it, and you will be part of it. And the next generation, the next phase will have its own faults and foibles that the later people will see, but this discouraging part that we're in right now is just what's necessary. Is the death that's necessary for the new life to come. So hang in there.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you there. We're on the precipice of a generational and cultural and social change,
Yes.
and it can create a lot of angst, a lot of fear, a lot of discouragement, but a lot of excitement as well, that we're about to see the birth of something new and different than what we've seen before. So that's always promising. So thank you so much for everything you've contributed today. And I'll throw you just one wild card.
Sure.
A few minutes here. Put on your English and literature hat, because reading and all of that goes with on reading well, as you aptly described in your book, was something that I came to a little bit later in life. Growing up, I did not have the love of reading that I have now, and so I'm much later in life discovering a lot of the classics that you list in On Reading Well. So if you're speaking to someone who needs to read, who needs to embrace that love for reading, what are the top 3 or 4 or 5 books that you would say, start here and you'll be inspired, and this will do something exciting and wonderful for you?
Okay, well, I will list first what my own old-time favorite, long-standing, is Jane Eyre. And if people have not read it, especially guys, they might think, oh, it's just about a woman and it's a love story or whatever. Well, it's a little bit of that, but actually Jane Eyre is an allegory for the Christian soul making its way in this modern world that we all know. So read it. It's wonderful. It's, once you get past the romantic part, you'll see it's about so much more. And then I would say I have not finished this yet. I am reading it for the first time because I'm a British literature specialist. So there's a lot of American literature that I haven't read, but I am halfway through, I am so in love with John Steinbeck's East of Eden. It is an amazing book, and it's a retelling of the biblical narrative in the Old Testament. It's just an amazing story. So I would say those two. They're both long, and the other thing I would say, I'll just give myself a little self-promotion here, is I have a series of 6 classics being produced and published by B&H Publishing that are written for those who are just learning kind of how to read classic literature. And right now, Austen's Sense and Sensibility and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness are out, and I give introductions that kind of help the reader know how to read those books, and then discussion questions to help you think critically through them. So it's really like me walking with you, holding your hand through these classics. So you can check those out too. It's like a little course.
Yeah, and since Halloween is tomorrow, Frankenstein as well, right?
It's already done. It'll be coming out in March. So
Okay.
Frankenstein is at the printers as we speak, and that's a great place to start too. So just wait until March, and then you can have my edition.
Dr. Pryor, thank you so much. Really appreciative of everything that you do and all that you represent. Thank you for your personal inspiration to me. Thank you for sharing your time with my class and with others as well. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I hope it was edifying.
Absolutely. Have a blessed day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.